as Allied forces stormed Normandy's shores on June 6, 1944, terrified German soldiers, some just 17, peered through smoke-filled bunkers at an unstoppable tide. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and abandoned by command. What they saw, what they felt, was not glory, but horror. This is D-Day. Through the eyes of the defeated on June 6, 1944. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the sea turned black with ships. Over 160,000 Allied troops charged the shores of Normandy. From behind steel-reinforced bunkers, German soldiers, young, outnumbered, and sleep-deprived, stared in disbelief. The first shells hit. Machine guns opened. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's so-called fortress, began to collapse in real time. Radio lines went dead. Artillery positions vanished in fire. Entire squads were vaporized before they could fire a single round. On Omaha Beach alone, the 352nd Infantry Division was crushed under an avalanche of steel and flesh. There was no air cover, no retreat, just chaos. And still they fought, some to survive, others because they were told to. Many knew they were fighting for a cause already lost. We know the Allied version of D-Day: bravery, sacrifice, liberation. But what about the other side? The men trapped in bunkers, screaming through smoke, watching history bury them alive. In this video, we will step into their boots, into the fear, the confusion, and the silence that followed. What did they see? What did they endure? And what truths about D-Day remain hidden in the memories of the defeated? Chapter 1. The calm before the collapse. German defenses and false confidence. Corporal Heinz Richter lit a cigarette in the dark, standing outside his concrete bunker near Omaha Beach. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and distant seaweed. He was stationed at Widerstands Nest 62, one of the most heavily fortified German strongpoints along the Atlantic Wall. His orders were simple: hold the line, no matter what. For months, Berlin had warned of an Allied invasion, but no one knew exactly where or when. Richter, like many others in the 352nd Infantry Division, had begun to think it might never come. Rumors flew constantly. Some said it would be at Calais. Others believed Norway. And even if it did happen, the Führer's voice on the radio promised that the Atlantic Wall was impenetrable. "We will throw them back into the sea," Hitler said. But Richter didn't feel invincible. He was only 20. His machine gun had jammed during training. The ammunition belts were damp from weeks of Normandy rain. Many of the men beside him weren't even German, conscripts from Poland, Russia, and Ukraine, drafted into the Wehrmacht or volunteering under threat of death. Few of them spoke the same language. Most had never seen real combat, and yet they waited. The Allies had masterfully fed the German High Command a feast of lies. Using Operation Fortitude, they created an entire Phantom Army, the first U.S. Army group supposedly led by General Patton, stationed across the English Channel near Dover. Fake radio chatter, inflatable tanks, wooden landing craft, even double agents convinced German intelligence that the invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. As a result, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, kept their strongest units, including panzer divisions, away from Normandy. Rommel had argued to move armor closer to the coast to respond quickly when the invasion came. Hitler disagreed. He insisted on holding them back under direct Führer control. This decision would prove catastrophic. The Atlantic Wall was more myth than fortress. Yes, there were bunkers, concrete casemates, artillery nests, and machine gun positions littered the cliffs, but they were incomplete, undermanned, and often poorly supplied. Organization taught, the Nazi military construction group had poured thousands of tons of concrete into the coastlines, but time was against them. Some sites had only recently been finished. Others lacked functioning radios or even ammunition reserves. German troops in the 716th Static Infantry Division stationed in Normandy were not elite. They were mostly older men, wounded veterans, and second-tier reservists considered unfit for mobile combat. Their artillery was outdated, many still using guns seized from the French in 1940. Most had never fired them under real pressure. Worse, communication across the units was painfully slow. Field telephones were unreliable. Radios were limited. Orders were issued in layers of bureaucracy that moved slower than the tides. 2 days before the invasion, Erwin Rommel had toured the Normandy coastline. He was frustrated. Supplies were thin, barbed wire had gaps, and key beaches were still unmined. He returned to Germany to plead with Hitler for more resources and, as fate would have it, to visit his wife for her birthday. He was not at his post when the invasion began. Rommel had warned repeatedly, the first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. The outcome of the war depends on them. But even Rommel did not believe the Allies would land during a storm. That was the Allies' advantage. At 12:15 a.m. on June 6, paratroopers from the U.S., 82nd, and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped inland behind German lines. Their objective: sabotage bridges, disrupt communications, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. From German positions, the night sky lit up with tracer rounds and the haunting roar of low-flying aircraft. To soldiers like Richter, it sounded like thunder from another world. But they didn't know the scale. They assumed it was a raid, another bombing run. By 3 a.m., German radar operators were reporting hundreds, then thousands of vessels off the coast. Commanders didn't believe them. Some dismissed the readings as mechanical error or diversion tactics. Others, paralyzed by Hitler's standing orders, waited for direct confirmation from Berlin. No one wanted to make the wrong move. At 6 a.m. sharp, Allied naval forces opened fire. Over 2,000 Allied warships launched one of the most intense bombardments in military history. Entire German positions were obliterated in seconds. Communication lines were severed. Command posts were turned to ash. Corporal Richter dove into the bunker as shells ripped open the hillside. A machine gunner to his left was killed instantly, decapitated by shrapnel. The sandbags outside their pillbox were already on fire. As the smoke poured in, someone screamed into the radio, "Find them strand! Enemy on the beach!" Within minutes, Allied landing craft hit shore. At Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, thousands of men poured out. Richter began firing. He didn't know at what, just shadows, shapes, and movement. His machine gun overheated after 10 minutes. There was no backup. In Widerstand's nest, 62 alone, German soldiers fired down on what looked like an endless wave of invaders. Heinrich Severloh, another MG-42 gunner, claimed to have fired over 13,000 rounds from his position, mowing down hundreds. They kept coming, he later recalled, like a flood of ghosts. German field commanders screamed for reinforcements, but the panzers, Germany's armored lifeline, remained idle. Why? Because Hitler was asleep. Only Hitler had the authority to release the armored divisions. His staff, terrified of waking him, waited until 11 a.m. to inform him. By then, the Allies had established beachheads across multiple sectors. When the 21st Panzer Division finally moved, it was disorganized. Too little, too late. Rommel's prophecy had come true. The first 24 hours were decisive, and the Germans had lost them. By the afternoon of June 6th, many German positions had fallen. Entire units surrendered. Others were annihilated. Richter's bunker collapsed under a direct naval hit. He crawled out, dazed, covered in blood that wasn't his. His last memory of that day, the sky darkening behind the flames and the faces of the enemy getting closer, not as monsters, but men. He survived. Thousands did not. D-Day was not just a failure of defense, it was the collapse of illusion. The illusion that the Reich was invincible, that the Atlantic Wall could hold, that Hitler knew what he was doing. For the German soldiers who lived through that day, it wasn't strategy or ideology they remembered. It was noise, fire, chaos, the sound of the sea, and the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 2. The Hell of Omaha. Inside the bloodiest beach, Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944, 6:31 a.m. Within moments of the first Allied landing craft dropping its ramp, Omaha Beach descended into unspeakable horror. German gunfire tore into the waves of American troops struggling to push forward through chest-high surf, overloaded with gear. The sea turned red. Bodies floated before they ever touched land. Concrete bunkers positioned along the cliffs rained death on the men below. Machine guns fired at a blistering 1,200 rounds per minute. Mines exploded underfoot. Entire platoons disappeared in seconds. Behind one of those machine guns sat Heinrich Severloh, a 20-year-old conscript stationed at Widerstandsnest 62. From inside a pillbox above the beach, he squeezed the trigger of his MG-42 and didn't stop for nearly 9 hours. The weapon, nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw, sprayed bullets with terrifying speed. Severloh later admitted he fired over 13,000 rounds that morning. "I didn't aim," he recalled. "There were just too many. I fired into the masses. They just kept coming." What unfolded before him was not a battle. It was a massacre. But inside that bunker, it was also fear, adrenaline, and a desperate will to survive. Omaha Beach was designed to be a death trap. The Germans had studied the terrain meticulously. Cliffs and ridgelines created natural choke points, barbed wire, anti-tank obstacles, and landmines lined the shore. Trenches zigzagged into the hills, leading to bunkers reinforced with steel and concrete. Mortar teams, artillery observers, and machine gunners had interlocking fields of fire. And unlike other beaches defended by static units, Omaha had the misfortune, or from the German point of view, the blessing of being defended by the 352nd Infantry Division, a unit filled with hardened Eastern Front veterans recently rotated into Normandy for rest. The Allies had no idea what they were walking into. The American troops came in waves, many of them drowned under the weight of their equipment. Those who survived the surf were instantly cut down by enfilading fire from above. Boats exploded. Radios were lost. Commanders were killed before they could issue orders. Some units lost 80% of their men within the first hour. The lucky ones crawled behind tank traps and the bodies of their fallen comrades, using them as cover. The beach became a graveyard, real-time and relentless. Inside Widerstandsnest 62, Severloh kept firing. His field of vision was a meat grinder. Shadows, movement, and chaos filled his gun sights. His loader was hit early. Mortar teams nearby were silenced by naval shells. His machine gun barrel overheated repeatedly. He swapped out parts with shaking hands. He did not stop. To his left, bunkers were being reduced to rubble. Naval destroyers were moving dangerously close to the shoreline. At 9:45 a.m., the USS Satterlee fired directly on his position. Concrete cracked, dirt rained from the ceiling, and blood pooled on the floor. Elsewhere along the line, men like Otto Schlemmer, another gunner, were experiencing the same disbelief. "We didn't understand how they were still coming," Schlemmer later wrote. "We hit them again and again, and they would not stop." The German High Command had insisted the Americans would break, that they were soft. But what these soldiers saw was something else. Waves of men crawling, running, charging through a hell they had no reason to survive. They were not supermen. They were stubborn, brave, determined to a terrifying degree. And still, the Germans fought. Many had no choice. Reinforcements weren't coming. Communications had collapsed. Field commanders were isolated. Radio lines were dead. Officers had no contact with neighboring positions. The 21st Panzer Division, held in reserve, was not released until midday, hours too late. Hitler, asleep and refusing to be disturbed, hadn't given the order. The Reich's military machine, so obsessed with control, froze at the moment it was needed most. Around 10:30 a.m., Allied troops finally began pushing forward. Demolition teams breached barbed wire. Flamethrowers cleared bunkers. Snipers picked off gunners. Engineers opened narrow paths through the sand. Small squads advanced inch by inch. At Pointe du Hoc, U.S. Army Rangers scaled 100-foot cliffs using grappling hooks under direct fire. The Germans fought savagely, but the line began to break. Some ran, some surrendered, others died in place. Heinrich Sevelo's machine gun jammed. His loader was gone. Alone, dehydrated, ears ringing, he crawled from the pillbox and surrendered. He expected death. Instead, an American soldier gave him water. That moment, he would later say, shattered everything. "I saw them as humans," he said, "not enemies, just men like me." By early afternoon, Omaha Beach was secured. Barely. The cost was staggering. Nearly 3,000 American casualties. Possibly 1,200 to 1,500 Germans killed, wounded, or captured. 15 primary German strong points, like Weiderstand's Nest 62, were neutralized or abandoned. Concrete bunkers, once touted as the backbone of the Atlantic Wall, were cracked open like eggshells. Hitler's impregnable defense had collapsed in less than a day. What did it mean to the men who lived it? For most German soldiers, it wasn't about the Reich anymore, not about ideology, not even duty. It was about survival. Many of them were not Nazis. They were farmers, clerks, sons drafted too young, men told they were defending Europe from chaos, when in truth they were guarding a regime already collapsing from within. Karl Zimmermann, a German private captured that afternoon, told his American interrogator, "When I saw the sky filled with planes, I knew Germany was finished." For decades, many German veterans refused to speak of Omaha, some out of guilt, some out of shame, others because they simply couldn't. The trauma was too deep, the images too vivid. Heinrich Sevelo didn't tell his story until decades later, when he met Joseph Barrow, a U.S. paratrooper who had been captured by the Germans. Two old men, one from each side. Their handshake, caught on film, became a symbol not of forgiveness, but of understanding. Sevelo died in 2006. He spent most of his life on a quiet farm in Germany. He said the war never left him, not the faces, not the sound of the sea, not the feeling of pulling the trigger again and again into the crowd. Omaha Beach wasn't just the bloodiest landing zone on D-Day, it was the turning point for many who fought on the German side, a moment when the myth of invincibility turned to ash, when the master race met the full force of Allied will, when war stripped away all ideology and left only men terrified, confused, and bleeding into the surf. For the Germans at Omaha, June 6th wasn't just a military defeat, it was the death of certainty, the collapse of belief, and the beginning of reckoning. Chapter 3, Fighting Blind, Fragmented Command, and the Collapse of Strategy. As tracer fire streaked across the early morning sky and Allied paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, one thing became painfully clear to German field commanders. No one knew what was happening. What began as confusion quickly turned into paralysis. German radar stations had picked up thousands of blips over the English Channel. Spotters reported masses of ships, more than ever seen in any theater of war. Yet inside German bunkers and command posts, disbelief reigned. Many officers assumed it was a diversion, a feint designed to distract from the real invasion site at Calais. After all, that's what Berlin had insisted. Normandy, they said, was just a rehearsal. But it wasn't. And by the time the truth set in, the German command structure, rigid, centralized, and obsessed with top-down control, was already beginning to fall apart. The German military's response to D-Day was hamstrung from the start by a fatal structural flaw. No one had the authority to act quickly. At the top was Adolf Hitler, who had claimed the sole right to authorize movement of Germany's armored divisions. His paranoia about disloyalty and his belief in divine timing had reduced strategic responsiveness to a joke. On the morning of June 6th, Hitler was asleep at his compound in the Berghof, and no one dared wake him. While Allied forces fought through machine gun fire and artillery, German officers spent precious hours waiting for permission to move. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in the West, and Erwin Rommel, in charge of Army Group B, had both argued for more flexibility. Rommel especially had pushed for panzer divisions to be stationed closer to the coast. He feared that once the Allies landed, it would be too late to drive them back into the sea. Hitler refused. He believed the main assault would come at Calais and ordered armored divisions like the 1st SS Panzer and 12th SS Hitlerjugend to remain inland. When the invasion at Normandy began, these units sat idle, fully armed, fully capable, and completely unusable. Ironically, on the morning when the war turned, Rommel was not at his post. On June 5th, believing bad weather would delay any invasion, he had traveled back to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and lobby for more support. He was in southern Germany when the first waves landed at Normandy. His absence was more than symbolic. Rommel had been one of the only senior commanders who truly understood the scale of what was coming. He'd seen the buildup across the Channel. He knew the air superiority the Allies held, and he feared what it meant. Rommel's insistence on pushing tanks to the coast had been overruled by the High Command in Berlin, and now the very scenario he predicted was unfolding. Without him on the battlefield to respond, by the time he returned to France on the evening of June 6th, it was already too late. Between 3 a.m. and 10 a.m., the German front line bled without reinforcement. Desperate calls for armored support came in from all sectors, especially from Omaha and Gold Beaches, but were met with silence. Hitler had issued a direct order: no panzer movement without his express command, and he was still asleep. General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, head of Panzer Group West, practically begged to release his tanks. Officers tried to reach Berlin. Rommel's staff, operating without their commander, hesitated. No one knew who was allowed to do what. For 7 of the most decisive hours in the history of modern warfare, the Wehrmacht waited. Hitler finally woke just after 10 a.m. and was briefed. Still convinced Normandy was a distraction, he delayed authorization until mid-afternoon. When panzer divisions finally began to move toward the beaches, they were slowed by Allied air attacks, destroyed bridges, and congested roads clogged with wreckage and refugees. The chance to strike back was gone. As German armor tried to reach the front, it encountered a battlefield already designed to stop them. Allied air power, Operation Neptune, dominated the skies. Fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Typhoon ripped into convoys with devastating accuracy. Roads were cratered, bridges were down. Every movement was delayed or completely halted. In one notorious incident, the Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armored units, began its movement toward Normandy. only to be bombed relentlessly. By the time they arrived near the front days later, they were badly mauled and already irrelevant to the beachhead fighting. Even worse, German commanders had no real-time battlefield awareness. They didn't know which units had held, which had broken, or even which beaches were in Allied hands. Orders were issued based on maps that no longer matched reality. Messages were handwritten, sent via couriers dodging air raids, and often arrived hours too late. On the ground, without leadership or support, German units were left to resist as best they could. Some, like those at Pointe du Hoc, fought to the last man. Others, isolated by paratrooper drops and naval fire, were surrounded and captured. Units didn't know where their flanks were. Bunkers thought they were holding the line, only to discover Allied forces had moved miles past them. There was no coordination, no broader vision. The soldiers felt it too, as Private Ernst Grossman, stationed near Sword Beach, later said, "We weren't defending a country, we were defending confusion." Morale began to shatter. Some men deserted. Others fought ferociously, believing relief was just over the hill. It never came. By nightfall, many Wehrmacht troops had surrendered, stunned not just by the overwhelming firepower, but by the total absence of leadership. What happened on D-Day wasn't just a result of Allied strength. It was the product of German weakness at the highest levels. Their doctrine was built on centralization, fear, and rigidity. Even capable commanders like Rommel and Rundstedt were handcuffed by political obsession. Decisions came from Berlin, not the battlefield. Hitler, increasingly isolated and erratic, saw loyalty as more important than tactical judgment. This collapse of initiative bled down the ranks. Junior officers hesitated, unsure whether to retreat, counterattack, or hold. By the time they made their choice, it was irrelevant. In contrast, the Allies thrived on decentralization. American and British units adapted on the fly, shifted plans in real time, and made battlefield decisions without waiting for permission. That flexibility, more than any single weapon, won the day. By the evening of June 6th, the Germans had lost more than a beachhead. They had lost the initiative. The myth of the Atlantic Wall had crumbled. Their best chance to push the Allies back into the sea had vanished, not in combat, but in waiting. The panzers moved too late. The Luftwaffe never arrived, and the commanders, trapped in a tangle of broken lines and failed assumptions, could only watch as the tide of war turned for good. In the coming days, the German defense of France would become a brutal retreat, but the fatal blow had already landed, not from a bullet, but from silence. The silence of radios, the silence of orders never given, and the silence of a Führer who slept while Normandy burned. Chapter 4. Collapse in the countryside, the German retreat, and civilian horror. The beaches had fallen, the Atlantic Wall was breached, and now the war spilled into the French countryside, into narrow lanes, hedgerows, and villages that had not seen battle in 4 years. But this was no orderly retreat. For many German soldiers, the days that followed D-Day were a descent into exhaustion, panic, and raw survival. The word retreat suggests movement, strategy, control. What happened to the Wehrmacht in the Norman countryside was none of those things. It was disintegration. From the moment the Allied beachhead solidified, German units began falling back, some in formation, others in total collapse. But no road was safe. Allied aircraft dominated the skies, turning every column of vehicles into a target. By day, convoys were shredded by Typhoon fighter bombers. By night, Artillery pounded crossroads and bridges. German soldiers moved through forests, ditches, even cow pastures, anything to avoid the open road. The bocage, Normandy's maze of ancient hedgerows, offered both cover and terror. The thickets, some centuries old, provided hiding spots for ambushes and tanks, but they also became graves. A mortar shell landing in a sunken lane could kill 10 men in an instant. Units that had trained in open terrain were suddenly trapped in a natural labyrinth, stalked by Allied snipers, tanks, and resistance fighters. German officers tried to restore order. Field courts were set up in roadside barns. Soldiers caught fleeing without orders were executed on the spot. One sergeant who panicked and abandoned his post was tied to a tree and shot by his own company commander. His body left for others to see. The message was clear: hold the line or die. But even the most brutal discipline couldn't stop the bleeding. At this stage, German troops weren't just facing soldiers, they were facing a war machine without sleep. American forces pushed relentlessly inland, supported by tanks, air support, and fresh reinforcements. British and Canadian divisions advanced from Gold, Juno, and Sword, pinning down German troops in Caen. And behind them all came endless waves of supplies, fuel, ammunition, medicine. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, was breaking apart. Fuel shortages, stranded vehicles, ammunition was rationed. Food disappeared, the wounded were left behind. In the village of Tilly-sur-Seulles, soldiers of the German 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, many of them just 17 or 18 years old, dug in against the British. The town was pulverized by artillery. House to house fighting ensued, but without coordination or reinforcements, it became a massacre. Survivors crawled from the rubble, deaf from explosions. Their uniforms burned to rags. One tank commander later wrote, "We were ghosts pretending to be an army." For French civilians, the countryside became a war zone overnight. Villages like Saint-Lô, Carentan, and Villers-Bocage, once sleepy farming towns, became killing grounds. Homes collapsed under Allied bombs. German soldiers turned barns into command posts. Snipers fired from church towers. The resistance sabotaged convoys with mines and ambushes. Caught in the middle were farmers, mothers, children, some loyal to the Germans, others secretly aiding the Allies. But when the bombs fell, loyalty didn't matter. In one documented incident near Aulnay-sur-Odon, a German convoy hiding near a schoolhouse was spotted by Allied scouts. Within an hour, the village was shelled by naval artillery. Nearly 70 civilians died. German survivors carried children's bodies from rubble, some later buried beside Wehrmacht dead. In the confusion, soldiers and civilians dug graves side by side. Many German troops were shaken by what they saw. Private Stefan Klein, writing to his mother days later, described a little girl pulled from a smoking farmhouse. Her hair was gone, her skin had burned off. She didn't cry, she just stared at me. The war they were fighting no longer had a front. It was everywhere, above, below, within. As German formations weakened, the French resistance grew bolder. The Maquis, bands of guerrilla fighters, emerged from forests and barns to ambush isolated patrols. They cut phone lines, derailed trains, blew bridges. They stole weapons from retreating columns and passed Allied intel across hidden radio lines. Their sabotage slowed the Germans even further, delaying reinforcements, blocking escape routes. But retaliation was swift and brutal. The SS Panzer divisions, already infamous for atrocities in the East, turned their wrath on suspected collaborators. Entire villages were evacuated, homes torched, hostages shot. In some areas, civilians were used as human shields. The front lines weren't just fluid, they were personal. Yet for all their terror, the German units were losing control. The resistance didn't need to win battles, just to bleed the retreat, and they did. Some German units continued to fight with fanatic resolve, others with mechanical obedience, but by the second week of June, many soldiers privately admitted what few dared say aloud: the war was lost. The Luftwaffe was absent, the Kriegsmarine, Navy, irrelevant. The panzers, starved of fuel, couldn't maneuver. The once feared Wehrmacht, masters of blitzkrieg, now stumbled blindly through unfamiliar fields, chased, bombed, outnumbered. In isolated hedgerows, soldiers dug trenches with spoons and bayonets. They waited for tanks that would never arrive. The Americans were like water, one soldier wrote. We tried to stop them and they flowed around us. We held a village. They bypassed it. We waited, and then we were surrounded. Some chose surrender. Others, fanatics or those fearing Russian retribution later in the East, chose death. In one orchard outside Caumont, 7 German soldiers made their final stand around a broken flak gun. When it jammed, they fixed bayonets and charged. None survived. By June 14th, many towns had fallen. Carentan was in American hands. British forces approached Caen. German maps were covered in red ink, beachheads spreading like infection. The carefully drawn battle lines of the Reich were now dotted with arrows retreating inland. Rumors spread that Rommel had threatened to resign, that Rundstedt had demanded Hitler negotiate peace, that Germany had been betrayed. The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was staying alive. Entire companies melted away in silence. Medics left wounded behind. Trucks drove off with officers and abandoned foot soldiers. In the churches of Normandy, Mass was held over the dead, French, German, American alike. The bells tolled not for victory, but for exhaustion. As the front moved inland, what remained in the countryside were signs of a broken army. Burned out half-tracks, shattered helmets, blood-slicked boots, diaries fluttering in the wind. In a field outside Fontenay-le-Penel, a British war photographer snapped a photo of a young German soldier lying in the grass, his eyes still open. In his pocket was a letter addressed simply, "To my brother, in case I do not return." He hadn't. For the Allies, the push continued. For the Germans, Normandy had become a grave, an open-air tomb for thousands, and yet the retreat wasn't over. The real collapse, the one Hitler still refused to admit, was just beginning. Chapter 5, The Longest Memory, Veterans' Regret, and the Silence After Defeat. They carried it for decades, not rifles, but the weight of memory. For German soldiers who survived Normandy, the war didn't end in 1945. It lingered in silence, in shadows, in unspoken rituals. Some became fathers, teachers, bakers, or mechanics, but none walked away untouched. D-Day had been just one chapter, but for many, it was the one that never truly closed. In post-war Germany, silence was the armor they wore. In a nation scarred by Nazi atrocities and global condemnation, few Wehrmacht veterans spoke of June 6th. Not to families, not to neighbors, not even to themselves. The guilt, confusion, and shame were too vast for words. Heinrich Severloh, the machine gunner at Omaha Beach, returned to his farm and said nothing for years. Only in the 1960s did he speak, after American veterans reached out. He later met Joseph Barrow, a U.S. paratrooper he may have once fired upon. They shook hands, 2 old men, no longer enemies, just survivors. The trauma didn't fade, it echoed in habits. Fathers who flinched at fireworks, men who hated beaches, veterans who wept in their sleep. Some became alcoholics, others shut down entirely. Their silence was often misread. But it was never empty. By the 1980s, as Germany's children began asking questions, a few veterans responded. One, Otto Schlemmer, returned to his Gold Beach bunker and cried. for the boys he'd killed, not the cause he served. It wasn't war, he said, it was slaughter. Some wrote memoirs, others confessed to priests, to cameras, to the sea, but many could never forgive themselves, not for losing, but for realizing their courage had served a criminal regime. Friedrich Krautmann, an artillery officer, spent years teaching about the Holocaust. I didn't shoot in Auschwitz, he said, but I shot for the same cause. His sorrow was lifelong. Others simply disappeared, changing names, fleeing to farms, or dying with secrets sealed in dusty boxes and forgotten maps. In the 2000s, reconciliation emerged. Former enemies embraced, tears were shed. And in Normandy, handshakes between survivors replaced bullets. Carl Zimmerman, a veteran of Sword Beach, said, "We do not shake hands because we forget. We shake hands because we remember." In 2019, on the 75th anniversary, one of the last surviving German veterans left a cross in the Omaha Beach sand. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The gesture said everything. Not for himself, for them. The German soldiers of D-Day were not all villains, nor all victims. They were men consumed by a system that demanded obedience over thought, loyalty over truth. Their story isn't one of glory, but of warning. Their silence wasn't cowardice, it was grief. The story of D-Day is often told in triumph, but through German eyes it is also a tale of confusion, collapse, and quiet shame. Behind the bunkers, behind the uniforms, were young men, some believers, some victims, none untouched by what they witnessed. So we ask you, what would you have done if your orders conflicted with your conscience? And can we truly judge the past without first understanding it? If this journey challenged your perspective or deepened your understanding of history, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that go beyond the battlefield into the hearts of those who lived it.